Hello everybody, Tobias here. I'm going to show you how to build this really cool architecture. This is a serverless architecture in Amazon's cloud, and it uses the API Gateway and EventBridge to process incoming requests. And the way it works is that the gateway will take incoming requests from the internet and it will send them to the EventBridge. The EventBridge will process rules that are set there to see if the request matches the rule. And if it does, it'll send it over to the Lambda function. And then the Lambda function, this is a Python function, can really do anything. Ours is simple and it just makes a log to CloudWatch. But if you learn about this pattern, this architecture pattern, you'll see how powerful it can be and what you could use it for in the future and other stuff. Just to kind of break it down a little bit further, so the gateway is an API gateway managed service that Amazon offers. And they'll take, of course, care of everything like scaling the gateway, repairing the gateway if there's an outage with some part of it, etc. There are two kinds of gateways. So there's the HTTP API gateway, and then there's the REST API. The REST API one is more powerful, but it does cost more. So if you're debating on which one you should want to use, you can check out this URL and then see which one meets your needs. And if the lower cost one does, then just use that. When it comes to the Terraform side, there are two major resources that you'll create for the gateway. So the first one is this one right here. I won't say it because it is a mouthful. But you obviously define parameters here. We'll get into that in a later part of this video. You do also have to create a stage resource. And the way that the gateway works is that you can create multiple different stages. So there could be one for prod, testing, staging, etc. There's also the default one. And what this really means is that when we push changes to the gateway, they'll get applied to the default stage and be available right away. There's also a gateway role and a gateway policy that we attach to the gateway itself. Okay, moving on. The EventBridge. So the EventBridge is a service bus, and what this really means is that you can send requests to it and then create rules on the event bus. The rules will get processed for each request, and then if there's a matching rule, it'll get sent on to one or more destinations. In our configuration, we're just sending it on to Lambda, but you can create some really cool architectures with the EventBridge. And so it's good to kind of know how it works and what it's used for. The configuration is really straightforward. So what we do is we create a CloudWatch event rule, and we're attaching it to the default service bus that EventBridge has. This service actually used to be part of CloudWatch, so you'll see the CloudWatch name in some of these configurations. And then we do create an event target here, and we give it our Lambda function ARN, and we give it the rule ID as well. So the EventBridge is pretty straightforward actually. It can get more complex, but it can also be very straightforward. Moving on here, we have the Lambda function. So the Lambda function, there's kind of two parts to it when it comes to the Terraform configuration. But just to step back for a second, if you aren't familiar with Lambda, this is a functions as a service. And so you create functions in popular languages such as Python or JavaScript or even other languages like Rust or Go. You write these functions and then you can run them kind of at any point. And Amazon will take care of scaling the function service up or down depending on the number of requests coming in. When it comes to the configuration side of things, you need two things. So we need our actual function, and that's what this is right here. We define what we call a function handler, and then in this function we define what it does. And as you can see, we're just using a logger. We're logging this to CloudWatch essentially. So we have this as a separate file, and then we create the Terraform configuration. So the first part of that is creating a zip file of our function, so we zip it up. The second one is actually creating the function itself on the Amazon side, and we give it obviously the path to the zip file. We give it a name. We set some roles and some handlers and some other settings like that. We also want to give the Lambda permission or give EventBridge the ability to invoke the Lambda function, and that's what this permission does. And then we have a few other policies and IAM related resources that we'll get into later. So that's the Lambda side. And then lastly, we have the CloudWatch resource. And what we're doing here is we're just creating a log group for a little project, and we're setting some parameters like how long that the logs will be retained for. Okay, so that was just an intro to this project, and then now we will go into the coding. Okay, now it's time to code this thing. So open your editor of choice and create a directory somewhere. This is the name of my directory, and I'm using VS Code. Now we want to create a main.tf file first, and this is our main Terraform file. The first thing we'll do is we'll paste in here the Terraform block. And in this block, we're defining two really important things. The first one, we're specifying our required providers, and we have one, that is the AWS provider. We set the source, which is from this path at HashiCorp, and we set the version, which is the latest version as of this recording. We also set the version of Terraform itself, and as of this recording, 1.3 is the latest. And this is required as our first thing. Second, we will specify the AWS provider settings. There are two things we're going to set here. The first one, we will set the name of the profile we use. The profile are the credentials that we'll be using, and these credentials are stored on my local computer as part of the AWS CLI configuration. If you don't know what that is, then you will need to go install the AWS CLI and configure it, which you can find plenty of directions on the internet too. So that's the first step. The next thing we do is we set the region, and this project will deploy to the US West 2 region. Okay, before we get into building out some more resources, there's two things we want to do. We want to use the data block to get the caller identity. The caller identity will return things like the credential username of basically these credentials right here, and the user ARN and things like that. So we get that, and then we get the region that we're currently set to, which per this setting is US West 2. Okay, now we're going to create the first major resource, and I'm going to paste this in kind of slowly so you can see. I'll go ahead and close this, and let's get rid of my video. So we're going to create the AWS Gateway resource with Terraform, and we set the name and we set the protocol type. But the more interesting part of this is kind of the body config. So you set the body, and we're using the JS encode function to encode this block right here. And what this does is it sets a path that our API gateway will listen to, or listen on per se. And if it receives a post request, then we formulate and structure what the response to that post request will look like. And then we set this integration, which is key here. So this is actually what will help us integrate the gateway to EventBridge. And we're eventing to the EventBridge put events type. So we specify what type we're doing, we specify the credentials, and this is an IAM role we'll set up in just a second. So we do that. We do have to specify a few parameters, which you can see here, and just some other kind of common settings that we have. So we do all those things, and then we want to create our stage. So the way that the API gateway works is that we have to pair the gateway with a stage resource. The stage resource, we have to specify the gateway that we're attaching it to, so that's the one we just created. And then we'll specify the stage name, which is, in this case, default. This can have other names and other values. It can be something like production or staging. but here we're doing the default stage. And what this means is, like, when we deploy any changes, like if we added a new path to the gateway configuration, it would automatically be rolled out to the gateway in production. So in addition to that, we are going to add first our role. So this is an IAM role, and we're using it for our gateway, and it has a policy. This policy is giving, it's a service principal policy, so it's giving access to the gateway service. The next thing we'll do is create the policy itself, and this is an IAM policy, and we will attach it to our role. And this one allows our events, for the EventBridge, we'll be able to do put events. And you can see that we're specifying our region that we set earlier, as well as our caller identity account. And we're doing that as the resource for this policy. Next up, we have the attachment. So we created the role and we created the policy, but we have to attach the role to the policy. And that's how you do it in Terraform. So here's the role we created above, and here's the policy, and that will attach it for us. Next up, we will create the event bus configuration. And we do that first by creating this event rule resource. When we create the event rule resource, we specify a pattern, and the pattern sets the account that we're using. So this is from our data block above, and it sets a source, which is our API gateway. Now you might see and say, hey, why does it say CloudWatch? The event bus used to be part of CloudWatch, or the EventBridge used to be part of CloudWatch essentially. So there's still some CloudWatch naming in the Terraform configuration. So this will create a pattern, an event rule pattern, and the next thing we do is we set an EventBridge target for that pattern. So here it is, the event target, and first we set the ARN of our function, and we'll create that a little bit later. And then we specify the rule, and this rule is the one that we just created. It's this one right here. So right now there's no Lambda function resource yet. We'll create that in a little bit. And that's it for the EventBridge configuration. It's pretty straightforward. You could create multiple targets if you wanted to, but here we just have one. Next up, we will create our Lambda function. So the way that we do that is we go over here to back to our directory. Let's create a folder called source, and in that folder let's create a file called lambda function.py. And in this, let me just grab the code that we'll use. So this code is going to be very straightforward. This is pulled from Amazon's site, so that's why we have that here. So this code will import JSON, which is part of Python, and then we're using this utility from AWS called their Power Tools. We create the logger instance here, and then we define a Lambda handler. And with the logger instance, we are logging an event, and by doing this, we will log an event to CloudWatch. Okay, so first we create that. We'll go ahead and close that, and then we can go back to our main file. And what we want to do here is create a couple Lambda specific resources. So the first thing we'll do is create this zip file of our Lambda function. So we're using the path module of Terraform to get our current working directory, and we just created this file here just a second ago. So we set the source, we set the type, it's going to be zip, and then we set the output, and we're going to place the zip file in our root directory here. Okay, so that will create a zip file of our function. Next, what we do is we create the function itself. So it's the resource AWS Lambda function, and we give it a friendly name. The function name will be based on this text and then our current account number. We specify the file name to the zip file. So this is the zip file that we just created. We do hash it, so we use this Terraform function to create a hash of the file based on the file name. We do specify a role, and we'll create that role in just a minute. It doesn't exist yet, but it will, and that will help us set the permissions that our role has, or that our function has. We set the path to the handler, so this one is the name of the function and then of the Python file that we created, and with a dot, and then the name of the function in the file. We set the runtime, and then we set the layers that we need. The layers are essentially, ways to add packages to Python, and we're using the AWS Lambda Power Tools, which was used by the function. Now it is time to add a permission that will let the EventBridge make a request to Lambda. And we do that with this resource. It's the AWS Lambda permission resource, and we give it this friendly name. We do have to specify a statement ID, so this is a unique ID within all of our permission sets. We specify an action, so we use the Lambda namespace and the invoke function action. We specify our function name, and this function was created right above. So if you see the naming convention, it says Lambda function, my Lambda function.function name. That correlates to this, and this. So that's the path. We do set a principal of events, so events is the EventBridge principal at Amazon, and we give the source ARN, which is the rule ARN that we created previously. And this will allow the EventBridge rule to send requests to our Lambda function. Next, we will create a role. We give it the Lambda role name, and then we assume the role policy, and this basically gives us access to the Lambda service to execute requests there. And we will also attach a policy to that role, and this is the policy that we'll attach. This policy, as you can see here, gives us the ability to create a log stream and to put log events, and logs is the CloudWatch namespace. And we give it the resource. If you look here, it's the log namespace within our current region and within our current account. And then we give it this full path. So it'll be AWS Lambda and then our function name. And I'll show you this later in the console, how to view that. And then to close out the Lambda functionality or the Lambda resources, we do attach the policy to the role. So here's the attachment, and this is the role that we just created, and this is the policy that we just created. And that wraps up all of the Lambda functionality. Okay, so we're almost done with the code. There's a couple more things we want to do though. We do need to create our CloudWatch log group. So we will want to create a resource of the log group type. We'll just name it my log group. And we specify the name path. And as you can see, we give it AWS/Lambda and then our function name. And that does correspond with the resource that we are attaching to our policy. And you can see it's a very similar, the end of this part is the same. So there's some similarity there. Okay, great. So now we have our log group and we can log actual events. And then we're just going to have 3 output statements for Terraform. So when we run this code and we apply it, we will get our API Gateway URL, we will get our Lambda function name, and we will get our CloudWatch log name. And with that, that is the complete Terraform configuration and the Lambda function configuration as we see here. And we are able to go ahead and apply this now, so we will do that next. Now that we have our code ready, we are going to pop over to Terraform and commit these changes. So the first thing we'll do is run Terraform init, and this will basically get all of our plugins and providers ready. So we'll wait for that to process. Great, we're ready there. Let's see if we can make this a little bit wider. Okay, great. So then we run Terraform plan. And this will let us know the plan changes. There are a lot, so there's 13 resources that it will add. And then when the changes are made, it will output, again, our gateway URL, CloudWatch name, and the Lambda function name. So let's just go ahead and run Terraform apply. And we will confirm and then wait for this to happen, which might take a little bit of time, so just be patient. Okay, great. So our plan and apply worked. All of our resources are ready, and we will now move over to test this out. To test our work, what we want to do is run just a simple post to the API Gateway URL. And so I'm going to do it with this command. This is a curl command. And if you look at it, we're using curl, and we have to specify the location and make sure that this is a request post. We have to put our gateway URL right here, so I'm going to go ahead and copy that. And then, oops, we have to just use our cursor to navigate all the way back. And I'll paste it right here. So the one thing to note is that we do have our request body. This is a JSON file, our JSON payload. We have the detail name right here, and then we have our message, hello from API Gateway. So just take note of that. We execute it, and we get a reply back, which is our event ID, so we know it succeeded. And now I'm going to head over to the console so that we can confirm that the change was successful. Okay, I've logged into the console now, and we're looking at our log group here. This is what was created. And let's refresh here. So, okay, we see there's a log stream. We have our events. And if we open up this one, we should see that the message was received. There it is, hello from API Gateway. So we've now confirmed that everything is working as expected. The request went from our terminal to the gateway, from the gateway to the EventBridge, from EventBridge to Lambda, and then finally to CloudWatch. And that, my friends, is how you build serverless applications on top of the Amazon cloud. Thanks.